Different Gender, Different Ethics. Part 2. Women's Historical Role in the Public Sphere. Let's take a moment to begin this presentation by looking at history and policy regarding gender roles and the rights of men and women. Traditionally, men and women have not been viewed as equal in terms of their intrinsic value or in terms of their opportunities, at least in some periods of history. And this has also led to a fallacy, I believe, concerning women that men have used to their advantage, which is an ironic fallacy, if you will, because it deals with morality. And it is the notion that women are somehow more morally centered and more caring than men, as though somehow this gives men a pass to engage in more what I would call brutish and abusive behaviors. And this raises the question, of course, of is there any antidote to this problem? Well, I believe there is. But also, there's an issue of the very idea of women being more moral intrinsically. Is that the case, or are women held in bondage to higher standards so that men may gain some sort of social, political, and cultural advantage? It is easy to identify in modern civilization, historically, that prejudice and tradition have played roles in denying women the value and dignity they deserve and the equal opportunities necessary for them to express themselves in meaningful and fulfilling ways and to achieve to the highest level of their potential. It must also be noted in this modern era, with the rise of global Islam, that Islam, which is being portrayed by many in the West as kind and caring concerning women's rights and women, under the guise that this is done to protect women and to revere women, is an absolute falsehood. The abuses of Islam concerning women, their rights, their opportunities, and how they are viewed as human beings is beyond argument. If you read the Quran and the Ahadith writings of the four great imams in the first 200 years of Islam, women are viewed as morally inferior, and the quote, protection of women is really simply a guise for power and control by men over women's lives. So, what can we say then in general about history and expectations? Well, in general, women have been treated as though their primary role is to conform to whatever standards and expectations are laid out by their culture, which is primarily male dominant. So they are not expected to do the unexpected, and this severely limits their opportunities. They are to adhere to tradition. Simply put, this means ladies don't rock the boat. What about pro-life and pro-abortion issues, where we find women in significant numbers in both camps? In fact, data suggests that the dividing line is roughly 50% on each side. And of course, this became a firestorm in 2020 when the Supreme Court ruling concerning the Dobbs case was handed out. And many on the pro-abortion side viewed this as establishing a law that banned abortion. Many on the pro-life side celebrated because they viewed it as a way to stop abortion. But what was it really? Well, it did not establish a national ban on abortion. That was not the focus of the ruling. Rather, it overturned the Supreme Court legislative overreach of Roe v. Wade, which occurred in the early 1970s, wherein the Supreme Court established a national right to abortion as a federal law. Only Congress can establish such a law by passing it through the House of Representatives and the Senate, and then following that, the signature of the President, which puts it officially into law. What the Dobbs case actually did was return the pro-life, pro-abortion issue to the states, allowing individual states to make policy regarding this issue as they best saw fit, which, for whatever it's worth, and it may not be much, in my opinion, that's probably a wise thing, because the states better know their constituency and the citizens of their states than does the federal government, which is quite removed. Now, I would call your attention here once again to the Imago Dei factor, which I think is very helpful because it is the ultimate equalizer concerning the intrinsic value, dignity, and worth of men and women, alongside how we should view and treat each other in practical terms in everything from marriage relationships to business relationships to the broader cultural, social relationships that we face. Well, in the Bible, God's image is the template for male and female. And it says clearly that male and female were created in God's image, and they were created equal and complementary. No superiority, no inferiority, and in fact, to complete God's design and image, both are required. In the New Testament, we find Jesus shattering social, cultural, and even religious expectations and regulations concerning the relationships between men and women and how men and women were viewed. Jesus remarkably engaged publicly on a personal level with women, which was viewed by his own culture, the Jews, and in particular the Pharisees and Sadducees, who ran the religious structure of the time, as inappropriate and even sinful. But Jesus didn't care. He communed with women in public. He invited them into his private fellowship with his disciples, and he invited them to take roles in his inner group that were roles of importance, of significance, of value. And he also uplifted and validated women who were oftentimes viewed as inappropriate, as outcasts, and even as deserving of death. The early church followed his example by not only elevating the status of women, but allowing women important roles of leadership in the church. There were deaconesses, there were teachers, there, some argue, were even preachers who worked in the early Christian church from AD 35 all the way to 400 AD until the rise of Manichaeanism, Gnosticism, Neoplatonism, and Aristotelian thought infected the church as it began to develop through the Middle Ages, primarily through the influence of Augustine, which radically changed once again women's rights and worth in a negative way. Thankfully, this was addressed by important Christian leaders over time to take the church back to what the scriptures really said in both the Old and New Testament, and what the teachings of Jesus showed regarding women and how they should be respected, valued, and treated with dignity. Therefore, this idea of, quote, a woman's job or a woman's work was shattered by the transcendent, revealed truth of men and women from the Bible. Servitude was not the focus. The actual focus was partnership. Men and women valuing each other and working together to make their lives whole, complete, and satisfying as they served one another equally and loved one another absolutely. Gender roles, then, were somewhat arbitrary, really, by the true Christian church as secondary to the spirituality that is the same for all. Gender roles, then, were ways of functioning for efficiency and effectiveness, but they were not locked in as absolutes that could never be negotiated or changed. Superiority and inferiority were non-issues for the true Christian. But what was important was that all loved one another, and there was a complementary or a completing aspect of relationships between men and women. This biblical view of male and female has been challenged by goddess theory, and this theory goes way, way back to antiquity. But goddess theory basically promotes that women came first and women were supreme. However, ancient cultures and the veneration of deities shows us something else. Actually, gods, male deities, and goddesses, female deities alike, were venerated, worshipped, and ritualized for the means of accruing power and control over life and others. Ancient cultures and patriarchy were the rule of the day. We do not find ancient cultures like the Sumerian, the Chaldean, the Hurrian, the Horite, which functioned as matriarchal societies. They were patriarchal. They had kings. They had queens alongside them, but make no mistake, the kings were in charge. They were male ruled primarily and male dominant. However, they did see the benefit of goddesses in terms of sexuality, fertility, and the infusion of spiritual energy. The veneration of deities in ancient times was largely about empowerment and manipulation, so that an individual, by appeasing the gods through veneration, could be protected and safe, while at the same time gain a kind of power and relationship with those entities, which could result in controlling their world and controlling the lives of others. The deities we're referring to were myriad. There were hundreds, sometimes thousands, and in the case of Hinduism and Buddhism, millions of gods and goddesses and spirits. But there were primary deities which were looked to again and again from culture to culture as the most significant ones. Deities who functioned as origin gods, gods like Enki and Enlil in the ancient Near East and the Fertile Crescent, or the sun gods like Ra in Egypt, or Sin in the Arabian Peninsula and in the Fertile Crescent. Storm gods such as Baal Hadad in Canaan and Marduk in Mesopotamia, Babylon, and Zeus in ancient Rome. Finally, gods of war and violence, sex and fertility were important, and these are depicted both as gods and goddesses. Most notable, I think, from antiquity is the goddess Inanna Ishtar, who was depicted as both the goddess of war and violence and sex and fertility. Over time, she was incarnated under a variety of names, from Inanna to Ishtar to Asherah to Aphrodite to Venus to Isis, but all of these names apply to the same basic goddess, who was a goddess from antiquity who exerted a great influence over culture. Alongside the veneration of gods and goddesses was the idea of apotheosis and power, the God-man ruler. The notion was that through various types of rituals, an individual, primarily a prominent individual like a king or a pharaoh, would be transformed into a divine ruler by being infused with the spirit of the god who is being venerated and summoned through various kinds of rituals. Oftentimes, those rituals engaged sexuality of some form or another. So the ritual infusion of the gods was very important, and the transformation of the ruler into the god-man, for example, the Osiris raising ritual in pharaonic Egypt that came out of the Amoritic connection when the Amorites conquered Egypt and established themselves as the ruling class. Eventually, over time, we arrive at a place in history where we have Plato and his view of women, alongside Aristotle's view of women and the Gnostic view of women. This all occurred roughly between approximately 2 to 300 BC down to around 400 AD. And the views of women were not all that positive. Aristotle, for example, viewed women as kind of a failed biological entity because they were not men. And this was a force behind the idea of gender identity and gender roles that came into Western civilization primarily through Augustine and his connection to Aristotle and Plato, which I think did great harm to what should have been the logical progression of the biblical view concerning male and female equality. But Gnosticism didn't contribute anything better. Gnosticism tended to view women as an inferior commodity and to objectify women, using women for sexual license because the body and the spirit were viewed as separate and distinct, the spirit being pure and righteous and spiritual, whereas the body was corrupt and unrighteous and evil. This, of course, opened the opportunity for sinful sexual behaviors because these were done in the body, and the Gnostic view was this had nothing to do with the purity of the spirit. We also have the problem of viewing history as behavior as justification. What has been done historically is self-validating concerning morality and ethics. It's the idea that because we can describe what was done, we can assume that what was done was just okay. The Baal gods, which you know as Baal, B-A-A-L, the Baal gods frequently incorporated sex rituals, human sacrifices, and cannibalism into the veneration of those gods. In fact, the words cannibal and cannibalism derive from two words from antiquity, Semitic words, Kana and Baal. Well, Baal means Lord and is a reference to the gods or the overlords, those spiritual entities that were venerated, and Kana is a word that means priest. So literally, Kana plus Baal means priest of Baal. And you can infer, I think, from that what the priest of Baal was overseeing and incorporating into the veneration of those gods. In addition, by the time you get to Greece and Rome, very popular festivals for venerating the gods were being performed. The Dionysian and the Bacchanalian festivals, which many people think originated with Greece and Rome, however, they did not. They go all the way back to Inanna, 7,000 to 10,000 BC in the Near East. And those Inanna Ishtar festivals bear an uncanny likeness to what we see in the Dionysian and Bacchanalian festivals, which came later. In fact, they were so wild and reckless and orgiastic that they were dangerous to participate in. And if you refuse to participate, then you could be physically attacked, and there are stories even of being killed or even being cannibalized while alive by having flesh cut from the victim and consumed before his very eyes. The point is, there was no time we can point to in human history where all was well concerning men and women in their relationships and their treatment of one another, except for that time which preceded what the Bible talks about as the fall from grace. So when we look to the Middle Ages and we talk about losing ground in the Middle Ages, this is only correct in the sense that what the early Christian church had reestablished as the ideal template for male-female relationships was discarded, degraded, and lost, which is a valid point. The effect of Aristotelian myopia concerning Christian history was not only inaccurate, but it led to drastic, harmful effects. Christian history through the lens of Augustinian philosophy, Manichaeanism, Gnosticism, Neoplatonism, and Aristotelian philosophy in 400 AD completely shifted and skewed this idea of relationships between men and women and how they valued each other intrinsically. The other problem, which we are facing in the modern era, is the selective identifying of women to portray men and the church negatively as evil forces, selecting women like Hypatia, Hildegard von Bingen, and Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, and using them as tools to show how women have been abused and mistreated, misunderstood, and devalued is somewhat limited and somewhat unfair. Now, that doesn't mean that women weren't mistreated, abused, and devalued. They were in many, many cases and in some periods of history, but it's not the whole story. Now, I've addressed already in previous presentations the problem with the historicity of Hypatia and what really happened in her story related to the Christian church. Hildegard von Bingen, though, was a remarkable woman who wrote much and composed great pieces of music and should be regarded as both an ecclesiastical and historical treasure. Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz is also another figure that deserves, I think, respect and attention. And I would encourage you to look up Hildegard's music, listen to some of her music online, and look up some of Juana Inés de la Cruz's poetry, her writings, which I think are quite interesting to read and are worthy of your time. In addition, the modern era has elevated the veneration of goddesses from antiquity into a kind of mother goddess benign entity that needs to be the supreme entity that is valued and worshipped in the world. This is not an accurate view of the veneration of goddesses from antiquity. The venerations of goddesses does not prove that women had an elevated status in these ancient cultures. It simply proves that there was an interest and recognition of male and female sexuality and how the female sexuality, as represented by goddesses, could be used for power, energy, and pleasure. The Inanna Ishtar rituals are proof of this, as well as the Kali cultism of Hinduism and Buddhism. We should also take a moment to address the fallacy of blaming Christianity and Christendom for all the evils of Western civilization. Actually, the influence of Judaism and Christianity upon Western civilization has been benevolent and immense. In fact, more of an influence than any other thing in the history of the world. And many of the advancements that we enjoy come directly from those traditions. But most notably, this idea of how we see ourselves as humans and how we see ourselves as men and women created in the image of God, the highest possible image that a person can have, and that we are all created alike in that image. It's important to note here that Judaism began around 1800 BC and Christianity began in the first century AD. And the early church was vibrant, grew even in the midst of extreme persecution for 400 years, and eventually became the dominant cultural force in Western civilization. It is a mistake to think that Christianity really began as a movement and institution around the time of Augustine, late 300 to 400 AD. The early Christian church had been in operation for centuries prior to that and got many things right, and the writers of the New Testament were diligent to address abuses and errors in belief and practice. Sadly, the rise of Christendom and the institutional church from around 4 to 500 AD down to 1500 did engage in numerous abuses, and what I feel, based upon the biblical text, were not just abuses of power, but were errancies or heretical views of biblical truth. However, these went unchecked because the only people that controlled the scriptures and what was said in the Bible were the church hierarchy. And of course, they had their own power agenda to maintain. There are no excuses for the abuses which occurred. They were sinful, they were evil, and thankfully, they were eventually exposed and, in many, many cases, have been eliminated. Anti biblical and anti Christian philosophy and policies are not okay. Not if you're going to claim to be a follower of Jesus and true Christianity. It is also important to note, however, that the abuses of power and the ill treatment of women was not exclusive to Christendom and the institutional church during this time. Neither has it been exclusive to the church down through history to the present. These kinds of evils existed in Europe, Asia, the Americas, Africa, the Near East. They all practiced in some form the subjugation of women and subjugation of others, distinctly separate from the influence of Christendom. A cursory reading of the Quran and the Ahadith writings in Islam make this clear. For example, concerning women and the slave trade, international slave trade, which actually began as an international business around 700 AD. The Muslim international slave trade from approximately 700 AD to the present exceeds 180 million slaves, 1/3 of which were male and 2/3 of which were female. Why? Because the females were viewed as more valuable commodities in terms of profit. The women could be sold into the sex slave trade business, which is what happened to them. And this is still going on today. In fact, just recently in California, a sex slave trade tied to Islam slavery was busted, exposed, and is now going to undergo some sort of criminal prosecution. So, let's take a moment and look at what the biblical view of women in the Old and New Testament really was. Well, of course, it was the Imago Dei, the image of God, equal, the same for both. But we also might take a quick look at some of the significant and heroic women who are listed in the Old and New Testament, which is unique to sacred scriptures. You don't find this same thing in any other faith systems in the world. Women like Rahab, who ironically was a prostitute but is presented as heroic. Women like Ruth or Deborah, who's functioned as a judge and military leader of Israel during the time of the judges. Women like Esther, who saved her people by becoming a queen in a foreign land. Women like Bathsheba, who had the affair with David, but then marries David, the king, and gives birth eventually to King Solomon, who established the greatest Jewish dynasty in world history. The Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus. Mary Magdalene, who was described as being possessed of 7 demons and delivered by Jesus, who became part of his inner circle and part of his leadership in the early church. And then Mary and Martha, Bethany, the sisters of Lazarus, whom Jesus raised from the dead. They both played prominent roles in the early church. And Priscilla, who co-tutored with her husband Aquila, the apostle Paul, who was Saul but then converted to believe in Jesus, and they trained him in the truths of the gospel and Christianity based upon what he already knew as quite a scholar of the Old Testament. These were all important women who played important roles, and they were respected and valued as women and for their roles in the early church. Paul's teachings in the New Testament books of 1 Corinthians and Ephesians regarding women sometimes are attacked primarily, I think, because they're misunderstood and they seem confusing to our modern mindset. But the context must be understood, and the intent and the effect is important. Paul was dealing with a pagan culture and society in Ephesus, the veneration of Goddess Artemis, yes, Artemis, the one that we named our space mission after, who was a goddess, who was a huntress, a powerful female entity, but also was connected in some respects to the sexuality of Inanna Ishtar. And the festivals that were done at the temple in Ephesus were orgiastic and could be dangerous for women. There was also a temple prostitution system where girls as young as 8 to 10 years old would be seated around the colonnade outside the temple, and men would come by, and sometimes there were older dudes, would come by and throw coins in their lap, and they would be obligated to have ritual sexual relationships with those men right there on the spot. The same kinds of activities were being done in Corinth, where Aphrodite, the goddess of sex and love, was being venerated, who is linked back to her origin as Inanna. And these rituals, again, were sexual, orgiastic, sometimes violent. And in these orgies, the participants oftentimes would dress up in animal skins and behave like animals, and they would engage in sexual behavior that was bestial, and sometimes even bestial sex, and of course, then same-sex relationships as well. What Paul was doing was trying to counsel women, and in particular young women, against being taken advantage of and abused. So when Paul talks about covering your head or keeping your hair up and not letting it hang long and not wearing makeup and dressing modestly, he's differentiating between the appearance of the temple prostitutes and their treatment then, and the appearance of women who were more wholesome and were not involved in those kinds of orgiastic ritual activities. So he was trying to protect young girls and women, because he said if you go out in public looking like this, men in this culture, who, by the way, the primary culture was not Christian, it was pagan, these men will see you through that lens, and they will presume that they can use and abuse you in these ways. So for your own protection, you need to do this. And I might add that Paul wrote most of the New Testament, and these are the only two instances where he addressed the appearance and behavior of women in this fashion. Why? Because in these specific contexts, it was necessary for their protection. Now, I'd like to conclude this presentation by drawing your attention to three women who I think were quite remarkable and who I recommend to you that you find out a little bit more about and experience a little bit of what they accomplished. The first of these is Teresa of Avila from Spain during the Renaissance, who was a remarkable Christian woman who has been identified as a saint by the Roman Church, and who wrote a remarkable journal about her own spiritual experiences and her mystical encounters with God. These were connected directly with someone she greatly admired, Saint John of the Cross, who was a Spanish mystic Christian monk who wrote wonderful poetry. One of his most powerful poems was titled The Dark Night of the Soul, which resonated deeply in Teresa's life, and she actually wrote into her journal an account of her personal spiritual journey as a dark night of the soul. Now, in recent years, Lorena McKenna, the great multi-instrumentalist, composer, and artist in residence at the Toronto Shakespearean Festival annually, has written a piece based upon St. John's poem and Teresa's journal called The Dark Night of the Soul, which I strongly recommend you listen to on YouTube. I think you'll find it rewarding if you do. Again, this is another connection across time of the works of important women and men and what they produced and their spiritual journey as it connects to someone in a modern era in our contemporary time. The second woman I would refer to you is Francesca Cabrini, who was a nun living in the late 19th century, the late 1800s, who on her own, while she was suffering from tuberculosis and was told she would live less than 2 years, she went on to live about 40 years, miraculously, but left the Vatican and Rome to come to New York City and work in the slums to help poverty stricken women and orphans, children, to find hope. And she started a movement that no one thought she could succeed at starting and maintaining, that became one of the greatest mission movements in the entire world, and it is known to you as Sacred Heart Missions. The story of Cabrini is told in marvelous fashion as a film drama put out by Angel Studios. And the title of the film is Cabrini, and I would strongly recommend you take a look at it. You will not be disappointed. And you may find yourself saying, why didn't this woman and this movie get nominated for Best Picture and Best Actress? Because it truly is deserving. The third woman I would mention to you is Sabina Wurmbrand, who is the wife of Robert Wurmbrand, who was famous for the book about his life called Tortured for Christ, in which he was tortured for his faith in Nazi Germany. And Sabina Wurmbrand, his wife, also stood with him against the horrific abuses of power and the Holocaust that was committed by the Nazis against 5+ million Jews, but another 5+ million Gentiles. And Sabina's story is well worth watching. She was a true leader right alongside her husband, and remarkably was able to face those who hated her the most with both love and forgiveness, while at the same time not backing off on what was right, what was moral, what was good, and calling out evil for what it truly is. There's a wonderful film about her life as well, titled Sabina. You can find it online. And again, you may find yourself not only inspired by this woman, but asking yourself why this movie didn't get the kind of recognition it probably deserved. Anyway, I hope you enjoy these experiences with women and their remarkable lives and the remarkable contributions that they have made to the world and to all of us. Thank you.